How did a routine US Navy F-18 airstrike against ISIS terrorists end up turning into an air battle against Syrian jets? On the morning of June 18, 2017, the US aircraft carrier CVN-77 was on station in the eastern Mediterranean to support US-backed militia forces. Lieutenant Commander Michael "Mob" Tremel was a member of Strike Fighter Squadron 37, nicknamed the Golden Bulls. He took off in an F-18E Super Hornet as part of the second wave of strike aircraft for the day. His wingman was Lieutenant Commander Jeff Kruger, also in an F-18E. Their mission was to fly several hundred miles to Syria, then make contact with coalition forces on the ground. From there, they would orbit the battlefield and wait for close air support requests against ISIS targets. This was a pretty routine self-escort mission for the US Navy pilots, so they took off with a standard loadout of air-to-ground bombs and missiles. During the morning briefing, flight crews on the carrier were warned to be extra vigilant against attacks by third-party aircraft during the day's missions. There was 3 reasons for this increased alert status. But before we continue, I want to tell you about this official Boeing Flight Simulator Cockpit Military Edition that I'm giving away to you. Also known as what you actually wish you got for Christmas. I custom built each part to simulate the A-10 Warthog's flight stick, throttle control panel, and easily the best way to feel the brat of the chain gun right down in your plums. I also included the Thrustmaster flight pedals that have a unique suspended mechanism ensuring smooth and fluid movements. I handpicked a curve monitor for full flight immersion, so you'll really feel like you're actually in a dogfight or pulling off close air support strikes. I'm able to do this giveaway thanks to our veteran-owned small business partner, GetEnteredToWin.com. All you have to do is click the link in the description or the pinned comment below. Head over to go.getenteredtowin.com/taskandpurpose, grab one of our cool limited edition collectibles, and get automatically entered to win the power of flight. You must be a US resident in order to win, and the deadline to enter is January 2nd, 2024 at 11:59 p.m. As always, thank you for your support and good luck. Just that morning, al-Assad's Syrian forces had attacked the US-backed forces at the town of Jadin. The first wave of strike aircraft that day had stopped the attack after they pulled off a show-of-force maneuver flying close to the ground, which was so loud and terrifying it spooked everyone into hiding. The second reason was because 2 months prior, the US military struck a Syrian chemical weapons storage facility with Tomahawk cruise missiles after the Syrian dictator used chemical weapons. Then, just 10 days prior, US F-15s shot down an Iranian drone over Syria. There was concerns that Syria may attempt to retaliate, so the rules of engagement were constantly adjusting to account for the increasingly complex situation, and Commander Tremel and Kruger needed to stay on top of all these geopolitical considerations in addition to their mission at hand. Tremel and Kruger were accompanied by 2 F-18C Hornets, which are smaller and shorter range than the E model, but still very capable multi-role strike fighters. The 4 US jets took off without a hitch and proceeded into Syria via the northern route, which took them along the Turkish border. This brought them into range of the Russian and Syrian air defense networks, but the routine mission didn't seem to cause any special alerts among the non-coalition radars. So far, everything was going according to plan. The flight arrived on station over the Syrian city of Raqqa around mid-afternoon. Raqqa was the seat of power for ISIS at the time. The city, along with its surrounding province, was the stage for heavy fighting between ISIS, coalition, Syrian, and Russian forces. US Lieutenant Commander Tremel's flight established radio contact with a coalition Joint Terminal Air Controller, or JTAC, on the ground in the town of Al-Tabqa, just on the southwestern outskirts of Raqqa. JTACs are specially trained personnel who act as a crucial link in the communication chain between ground and air forces. Without them, airstrikes are not only less accurate, but pose a far greater danger of accidentally hitting friendly forces. Right when the flight of 4 F-18s were getting filled in on the ground situation by the JTAC, a Russian SU-27 flanker fighter jet appeared on scene. Some sources claim it was the more modern Su-35. They look similar and it's easy to get the two confused, but the majority of reports state that it was an older Su-27 variant. The Su-27 is a very dangerous and capable 4th-generation multi-role fighter aircraft and could potentially carry enough armament to shoot down all 4 US aircraft if it were outfitted in a full air-to-air superiority loadout. But Russian aircraft weren't unusual neighbors in the skies above Syria, and the Su-27 appeared to just be orbiting at high altitude to monitor the airspace. So US Lieutenant Commander Tremel and his flight team proceeded with their mission. The F-18s entered a type of holding pattern called a close air support stack, where they awaited targets to be relayed via the JTAC. A close air support stack is kind of like an order of battle or kill chain for aircraft. It's a mix of air power, including you could sometimes have the MQ-9 Reaper drones, AC-130s, or B-52s, all with different capabilities useful for different targets. It's like a Venn diagram of aircraft lethality with some overlap. These assets are then organized through a series of verbal back and forth communications with the JTAC to set them up in the most effective way possible, considering the type of target you're trying to destroy, be it tanks, infantry, or fortifications. While the F-18s entered the close air support stack, Lieutenant Commander Tremel started having issues with the targeting pod attached to his aircraft. Targeting pods are packed full of sophisticated sensors on a mechanically stabilized gimbal, so there's a lot that can go wrong with them. Targeting pods with technical difficulties are an occasional fact of life for pilots, and it's one of the many reasons redundancy is built into combat missions at the planning stage with multiple aircraft and multiple weapon systems. Because things will inevitably go wrong, the ability to adapt and overcome is a mark of an outstanding pilot. In communications with the rest of his flight, Tremel decided to break off from the formation and monitor the circling Su-27 to cover his wingmates while they continued with their strike missions. He switched his Super Hornet's master mode into an air-to-air configuration and watched the Russian jet. The different modes optimize the radar tracking for engaging either aircraft, or you can switch to modes that optimize for striking ground targets. The all-digital cockpit of the F-18 Super Hornet gives pilots much more flexibility than what traditional avionics offer. The Su-27 still uses mostly analog instruments. With the improved radar settings, Tremel noticed a second unidentified radar track on his screen moving at high speed. Tremel moved in for a closer look and visually confirmed that the newcomer was an Su-22 fitter, belonging to the Syrian government's air force. What you're watching right now is footage from the actual incident, likely from several jets compiled into one video. The recorded footage from Tremel's own jet remains classified and unavailable to this day for reasons that we'll find out in a minute. The Su-22 is the export version of the Soviet Su-17, originally designed back in the 1960s. Adopted into Soviet service in 1970, it was built as a fast and agile fighter bomber thanks to its variable sweep wing design. While it could mount missiles and defend itself against mid-Cold War jets, the aircraft was primarily used as a bomber and could actually fit up to 8,800 pounds of ordnance across its 12 hardpoints. Syria had about 39 Su-22s at the start of the Syrian civil war, a serious danger to any ground troops. Syria used them extensively against ISIS targets and opposition forces alike. The appearance of a Syrian jet bomber in the area immediately set off alarm bells in US Lieutenant Commander Tremel's head because he knew that there were US-backed SDF forces currently engaged with ISIS militants in the city. From his briefing, he knew Syrian forces had already attacked the SDF position at nearby Jadin that morning. Tremel had to think quickly. The Su-22 could be going for the ISIS stronghold within the city, so he watched the Syrian aircraft's course closely to determine its target. Tremel confirmed that the bomber was heading directly for US-backed SDF lines. The US F-18s didn't have direct communication frequencies to the Syrian Air Force, so Tremel got on the horn with a coalition airborne warning and control system plane to relay warnings to the Syrian pilot to wave off. When the Su-22 didn't respond, Lieutenant Commander Tremel escalated to more visual warnings. He headbutted the Syrian jet 3 times. This maneuver is also sometimes called a thump, where a pilot flies just over the canopy of another aircraft and pops flares just in front. This is an unmistakable warning sign that even a space cadet like myself couldn't miss. There's essentially no way the Syrian pilot didn't notice even one headbutt, yet he still didn't respond or divert course after 3. At one point in time, if this aircraft would head south and work its way out of this situation, it'd be fine with us. We could go back to executing the mission. That's a quote from Lieutenant Commander Tremel. By now, the Su-22 was getting close enough to the SDF forces in Jadin to begin its attack run, and the Syrian pilot pitched his aircraft into a dive. At 6:43 p.m. local time, Lieutenant Commander Tremel visually confirmed the bombs left the Su-22's bomb racks and struck the SDF positions, causing an unknown number of injuries. Having personally witnessed a Syrian aircraft attack friendly forces on the ground, Tremel knew the rules of engagement now made the Su-22 a legitimate target. There was still the complication of the Russian Su-27 high overhead though, which could retaliate against Tremel and his entire flight of bomb-laden F-18s if he fired at the Syrian jet. But from his point of view, if he let the Su-22 get away with bombing US-backed forces in full view of American pilots, Syria could declare open season on the SDF and other allied troops on the ground. Tremel had to make a split-second decision to shoot or not to shoot, a decision that could have major international consequences and potentially deadly repercussions for him and his wingmates. As the Su-22 pulled out of its dive, Tremel made his decision. At a range of about 1.5 miles, well within the AIM-9X missile range, and in perfect position behind the Su-22, Tremel locked and launched an AIM-9X Sidewinder missile at the climbing Syrian jet. Typically, the authorization code goes first, and it lets everyone on the radio net know what type of munition you fired. The AIM-9X is typically designated Fox 2. This is then followed by the target information, something like bandit at 12 o'clock 20 miles high. Then that's followed by a confirmation call, missiles away. The Su-22 popped flares, the standard issue countermeasure for infrared missiles. But something unexpected happened. The AIM-9X, the most advanced infrared-guided missile in the US arsenal, went for the flares. The Sidewinder had been spoofed and failed to shoot down an aging Cold War-era bomber from perfect range and position. Lieutenant Commander Tremel reacted instantly. If heat seekers wouldn't work, he had a radar-guided AIM-120 AMRAAM ready to go. Normally fired from much longer range, there was a risk that the AMRAAM wouldn't have time to lock and properly guide itself onto the close-range Su-22. Tremel fired Fox 1 and it soared through the air towards the target. The missile had a top speed of about Mach 4 or 1,340 meters per second. The missile detonated against the back half of the Su-22, sending it spiraling towards the ground. Tremel had to veer sharply to the left to avoid the mid-air debris. As he did so, at the last second, he saw the Syrian pilot eject before the plane ultimately hit the ground in a massive explosion. The whole incident, from initial detection to shootdown, only lasted 8 minutes. But the implications would be immense. For now though, the American pilots had more immediate concerns, with a Su-27 overhead and a whole network of Russian air defense systems in range. The pilots communicated what just happened over the tactical radio net and received clearance from the JTAC to exit the area before the day got even more exciting. The Russian jet thankfully didn't engage the flight of F-18s as they left the combat zone. The 4 US pilots refueled from a nearby KC-10 extender before splitting into 2 groups. Tremel and Kruger in their F-18Es flew back to their aircraft carrier via a southern route through Iraq, while the 2 F-18Cs diverted to provide air support for coalition forces in Iraq. The Super Hornets landed on the US aircraft carrier without further incident and debriefed with their commander. Lieutenant Commander Tremel had just scored the first US air-to-air kill of a manned aircraft since an American F-15 shot down 2 Serbian MiG-29s in 1999. But in spite of the historic event, the rest of Tremel's night was pretty anticlimactic, which was just fine by him after the earlier adrenaline rush. Meanwhile, the situation in Syria was already intensifying after the bombing and shootdown. SDF and Syrian government forces engaged each other in open combat, and SDF forces ultimately had to retreat from Jadin. The pilot of the Su-22, Syrian Captain Al-Fad, was safe and sound after his ejection parachute landed near southern Raqqa, where he was recovered by Syrian government forces the next day. The Syrian and Russian governments were furious, issuing strong statements that denied the US account and asserted that the bomber had been on a mission against ISIS. Russia temporarily closed their end of deconfliction hotline established between the Russian Ministry of Defense and coalition forces. Additionally, Russia threatened they would treat any coalition aircraft west of the Euphrates River as hostile. But it was hard to argue against the multiple eyewitnesses and the data from multiple sources presented by US-led coalition verifying the Su-22 attack against SDF troops and not ISIS. Without clear evidence of their own to present, Syrian and Russian forces didn't escalate their protests and threats against the US any further, which is something we can all be thankful for. The Syrian civil war was already messy enough as it was, and no one wanted the US and Russia getting into a shooting match over Syria that triggered World War III. The events of that day were part of the broader context of the Syrian civil war and international campaign against the brutal ISIS terrorist group. Since 2011, Syria has been embroiled in a war between Bashar al-Assad's government forces backed by Russia and Iran, and a variety of rebel groups including Kurdish militia, military defectors, Arab Spring revolutionaries, and a hodgepodge of other ethnic and religious groups. These different rebel groups fought on their own or in larger coalitions like the Free Syrian Army and the Syrian Democratic Forces, but often fought against each other too. Around the same time period, the infamous extremist terror group ISIS reared its ugly head, taking advantage of the war-torn land to carve out huge sections of regions for its own self-declared Islamic State, its own caliphate, prompting a massive response from Arab nations, NATO, Iran, and Russia. To make things even more confusing, foreign countries like Iran and the United States backed different factions of the Syrian civil war, both for their own goals and as an extension of the fight against ISIS. By 2017, Syria was a swirling mess of different fighting forces with shifting priorities and allegiances. But there's still one nagging question that's keeping me up at night. Why did the AIM-9X fail to hit its target? The missile is a sophisticated current-generation munition, but it had trouble shooting down an antiquated Su-22. We may have some clues though, thanks to test results on an earlier version of the Sidewinder. In 1987, the US got a hold of a flare dispenser from a Su-25 Frogfoot that had been shot down in Afghanistan. The Soviet dispenser was sent to the 4477th Test and Evaluation Squadron located in Nevada, a secretive unit that specialized in analyzing enemy aircraft and equipment. The 4477th was eager to try out the AIM-9P against actual Soviet flares, and they discovered something interesting in the process. The AIM-9P was very good at screening out and rejecting NATO flares, but loved tracking Soviet flares instead. As it turned out, the Soviet flares were incredibly inconsistent in their construction and burn characteristics, making it hard for the AIM-9P to identify them as a countermeasure and not as hot jet engines, while NATO flares always look exactly the same. It was a classic case of tuning weapons around your own equipment and not anticipating the different standards of Soviet equipment. But it seems likely a similar phenomena was at work in the 2017 incident. The exact reason is still a mystery, at least in open source intelligence world. There are still many other possibilities: faulty missile, bad roll of the dice. It's still unknown why the Syrian Air Force thought it would be a good idea to attack US forces under US protection while in full view of American combat aircraft. Maybe they were testing American resolve, or maybe they forgot that the US resolve is inherent. Maybe there was a miscommunication and the Su-22 pilot really thought he was attacking the ISIS forces despite American warnings. As the Syrian civil war continues, even now in 2023, we may never know the reasons behind Syria and Russia's actions on that day. But thanks to this incident on June 18, 2017, we know that no matter how advanced an aircraft or weapon system is, it's just as important to have a cool, calm, and well-trained pilot at the controls. And if you want to learn more about close air support, I recently made a video about the JDAM smart bomb. Why would you rather use a smart bomb when you could use artillery, for instance? And what's the future of smart bombs going to be? So you can click the link in the corner of the screen or the description of the video. And a heads up, we have one last video coming out on December 31st, New Year's Eve. So I'll see you then. And I just wanted to say thank you all for your support this year. It's been a wild year and I appreciate your time and can't thank you guys enough, because getting to make these reports for you continues to be the highlight of my life. Remember, you can head over to go.getentertowin.com/taskandpurpose by clicking the link in the description below or the pinned comment. You can support the channel and the free content we put out twice a week by grabbing a limited edition collectible and get automatically entered to win. Deadline to enter is January 2nd, 2024 at 11:59 p.m. Thank you for your support, guys.